In episode 2, we followed the investigation back to this house in Olney. We talked about Eugene Horsch, his June 2026 arrest, the guns, the fake federal credentials, the chemicals investigators discovered inside the property, and the missing women whose names have now become tangled in one of Philadelphia's strangest ongoing investigations. But there is something I deliberately didn't fully unpack in that episode. Because before Eugene Horsch became the name appearing in headlines, there was his father, Raymond Charles Horsch, better known as R.C. Horsch. And once you begin looking into R.C.'s life, the story takes an entirely different turn. R.C. was a filmmaker, a photographer, a writer. He had a criminal history, and he created extraordinarily dark fictional material involving violence, exploitation, and serial killers. And then there is Amy McHale, R.C.'s former wife. Amy disappeared in 2016. According to her family, the last time they ever heard from her, Amy said she was inside the same West Chew Avenue house with R.C. Horsch. She has never been found. Now, 10 years later, investigators are examining an enormous amount of material connected to that property, and R.C.'s old films and writings have become part of what authorities are trying to understand. But there's something we need to establish immediately. R.C. Horsch was never charged with Amy McHale's disappearance. Police have not publicly named him as a person of interest in her case. And disturbing fiction, even extremely disturbing fiction, is not evidence that someone committed murder. That's exactly what makes this chapter so difficult, because we're going to encounter things that sound like they belong in a horror movie. But this isn't a horror movie. There are real missing women at the center of this. So tonight we're going to separate what R.C. created, what actually happened, and what investigators are still trying to determine. And by the end of this episode, you'll understand why the history of the man who lived inside that Olney house may be one of the most important and most complicated pieces of this entire investigation. So to understand how we got here, we have to understand the man who came before Eugene. Raymond Charles Horsch, better known as R.C. Horsch, was born in Pennsylvania in 1943, and describing his life isn't easy. R.C. was a photographer, filmmaker, writer, and artist. He became involved in Philadelphia's underground film scene decades ago, and eventually produced erotic films, photography, and writings that deliberately pushed boundaries. But there was another side to his history. R.C. also had a documented criminal record involving counterfeiting, drugs, and years spent as a fugitive. In the 1970s, federal authorities accused him of involvement with counterfeit money. He later fled the country before eventually being captured in Florida in 1985. Years later, in 2009, authorities found hundreds of marijuana plants at his Chalfont property, leading to another federal prison sentence. That history matters, but what makes R.C. particularly relevant to the investigation we're following isn't simply his criminal record. It's his connection to 417 West Chew Avenue. R.C. acquired the Olney property after his aunt died in 2004. In 2007, ownership was transferred to Eugene for $1. After R.C. was released from federal prison in 2013, he eventually lived there until his death. And inside that house, R.C. continued creating films, photographs, stories, some of them extraordinarily dark. And that's where things become much more complicated. R.C. Horsch wasn't creating conventional entertainment. His work intentionally explored subjects many people would find disturbing: sexual violence, sadomasochism, addiction, death, and women placed into extremely vulnerable situations. According to an extensive investigation by the Philadelphia Inquirer, R.C. recruited women, some struggling with serious drug addiction, to appear in his photographs and films. Some of those productions simulated violence and even death. That sounds alarming today, considering what investigators are examining. But there is an important distinction we need to make. Simulated violence is not evidence of actual violence. These were produced images and films. And R.C. seemed fascinated by deliberately making his audience question where his fictional persona ended and the real R.C. began. That's something we'll encounter repeatedly in this episode. Because he didn't only do it through photography, he did it through his writing too. And when you look at the books R.C. produced, you begin to understand just how deliberately dark that persona became. This is where R.C.'s story becomes especially strange. He wrote and produced material with titles including Annie, Slaves, Transgressions, Eroto, and Empathy. And Empathy is particularly noteworthy. It was described as an autobiographical style memoir centered around an empathetic serial killer. Reporting on R.C.'s writing says his stories contained sadomasochists, serial killers, and women struggling with substance abuse or mental health problems. Now imagine being an investigator in 2026. You're searching a property connected to missing women. You're going through old computers, discs, videos, photographs, and handwritten documents. And then you discover that the deceased man who spent years living there wrote extensively about serial killers. That's going to get your attention. But here's where we have to resist jumping to conclusions. A person writing about murder doesn't make that person a murderer. Stephen King isn't responsible for the crimes in his books. Horror filmmakers aren't committing the acts they put on screen. And R.C.'s writings cannot simply be treated as confessions. But investigators now face a difficult task, determining whether everything they're looking at was fictional or whether anything within this enormous collection could potentially document something real. R.C. apparently enjoyed making that distinction difficult. The Inquirer's investigation found that he presented portions of his own life as autobiographical while mixing them with fiction. He cultivated an outrageous persona: artist, pornographer, drug manufacturer, counterfeiter, fugitive, writer, provocateur. Some of those labels came from documented criminal cases. Others became part of the mythology R.C. built around himself. And that's exactly why we can't look at one disturbing photograph or paragraph and declare that it depicts reality. Investigators have to authenticate it. When was it created? Who appears in it? Where was it made? Was it staged? Was it part of a film? And perhaps most importantly, can the people appearing in it be accounted for? Because eventually, this story stops being about fictional women. A real woman disappears, and she wasn't a stranger to R.C. She had once been his wife. Her name was Amy McHale. Amy and R.C. had known one another for years. According to Amy's family, R.C. met her while she was struggling with addiction. Her mother later described how Amy initially viewed R.C. as someone who had helped her. The two eventually married in September 2004. Amy was approximately 30 years younger than R.C. Their marriage didn't last. They divorced several years later, but the relationship didn't completely end. Amy's daughter told reporters that the two remained friendly, and Amy periodically returned to visit R.C. after he moved into the Olney property. And that's incredibly important, because on a June night in 2016, Amy went back there. June 13th, 2016, Amy McHale was at the West 2 Avenue house with R.C. That evening, she called her mother. Amy sounded intoxicated and said she was coming home. Her mother told her to stay where she was rather than attempting to travel home in that condition. Early the following morning, Amy left a voicemail for her daughter saying that she was okay, and then nothing. Amy was never heard from again. She was 44 years old, a mother, a grandmother, and her daughter was preparing to get married. Her family has said Amy sometimes disappeared for short periods. But this was different. Days became weeks, weeks became months, and eventually years. Police questioned R.C. According to reporting, R.C. gave authorities and Amy's family essentially the same account. Amy had been drinking vodka. He went to sleep. And when he woke up, Amy was gone. For Amy's family, that explanation never provided closure. But we need to be extremely precise here. R.C. Horsch was not charged with causing Amy McHale's disappearance. Police have not publicly established that Amy was killed inside the Chew Avenue house, and the forensic testing reported so far has not identified Amy's DNA inside the property. There's another important fact. Eugene was incarcerated when Amy disappeared. According to reporting reviewed by the Inquirer, he wasn't released until approximately a month afterward. So in 2016, attention naturally centered on the person Amy was reportedly with shortly before she vanished. RC years passed without an answer. The house remained. RC continued his life. Amy remained missing, and eventually time ran out for anyone hoping to question RC again. In May 2025, Raymond R.C. Horsch died. He was 82 years old. The reported cause was chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. He died without Amy McHale ever being found. And at that point, there was no massive missing women investigation surrounding West Chew Avenue, no national headlines, no enormous FBI presence outside the property, no public understanding of what would unfold the following year. RC's death could easily have been the end of this story. Instead, it became the end of one chapter. Because approximately 13 months later, RC's son, Eugene, would have an encounter with law enforcement in Center City, Philadelphia, and that encounter would send investigators straight back to the house where his father had lived. And now we're back where episode 2 brought us, 417 West Chew Avenue. Except now you know some of the history behind those walls. This wasn't simply Eugene Horsch's house. It was where RC spent the final years of his life. It was a location used in connection with some of his creative work, and according to Amy's family, it was the last place Amy was known to have been before she disappeared. Then came June 19th, 2026. A U.S. Park Police encounter involving Eugene near Independence Hall triggered an extraordinary chain of events. Authorities said they recovered drugs, weapons, and fraudulent identification. But one piece of identification was especially strange, because it contained the name of a woman who was actually missing, Blair Tonzelli. And suddenly, Amy wasn't the only missing woman connected in some way to this story. This is where father and son must remain completely separate. The allegations involving fake federal credentials belong to Eugene Horsch, not RC. Authorities said Eugene possessed fraudulent law enforcement identification, including a fake DEA credential. They also recovered firearms and drugs during the June encounter. A woman with Eugene allegedly presented identification containing Blair Tonzelli's name. Investigators determined that she wasn't Blair. According to police, the woman said Eugene had made the identification for her. That discovery opened another door. Blair had been reported missing years earlier, and reporting indicated she had connections to the Horsch property. Investigators now had Eugene. They had a fake identity belonging to a missing woman. They had Amy's unresolved disappearance, and they had a house connecting multiple pieces of the story. So authorities went inside. What investigators encountered created even more questions. Authorities reported finding hidden compartments, chemicals, unidentified liquids, another firearm, and a 55-gallon drum connected to water lines leading toward a hole in the ground. They also discovered writings. One handwritten document reportedly referenced hurting unspecified people and mentioned serial killer Ted Bundy. But investigators immediately faced the same problem we've discussed throughout this episode. Was it real or was it fiction? Authorities were working to authenticate the document and determine whether it could instead have been material intended for a novel or screenplay. And remember whose work was also associated with this property: R.C. Horsch. A man who spent decades deliberately creating fictional material about disturbing subjects. Investigators couldn't simply assume. They had to examine everything. By this point, two names were dominating the public discussion: Amy McHale, and Blair Tonzelli. Amy disappeared in 2016 after being at the property. Blair was reported missing years later and had also reportedly spent time around the Horsch home. But investigators were dealing with conflicting signals. Initial reports suggested that testing inside the property had detected what appeared to be a significant quantity of blood. That sounded explosive. Then came an important update. Further forensic testing determined that what investigators initially believed could be blood wasn't real blood. And testing reported in July had not identified DNA belonging to Amy or Blair on the items examined at that point. That is exactly why following this case carefully matters. The first headline isn't necessarily the final answer, and despite those negative tests, investigators weren't finished. Far from it. Investigators began examining an enormous archive associated with the property. Documents, CDs, videos, text messages, handwritten material, unpublished films, unpublished writings, and that's where RC's history suddenly became relevant all over again. Investigators weren't looking at his published work simply because it was disturbing. They were trying to understand whether anything within the material they recovered could help explain the missing person cases. And that distinction is crucial. The evidence boxes in our image are a visual recreation. We're not claiming those specific labels represent actual police evidence, but the investigative challenge is real. RC spent decades mixing autobiography with fiction. Now investigators have to untangle that material without the author himself alive to explain it. And every photograph, every video, every manuscript has to be viewed in context. Investigators didn't restrict their search to computers and paperwork. They returned to the physical property. Police and federal investigators searched the house and surrounding land, and later excavation work extended to a pipe beneath the property. For neighbors, the transformation was dramatic. A deteriorating brick house on an ordinary Philadelphia block was suddenly surrounded by police vehicles, federal agents, forensic personnel, and crime scene tape. Online speculation exploded. People began calling the property a murder house. Some began treating RC's fictional writings as though they were confessions. Others assumed Eugene must be responsible for every missing woman whose name appeared in reporting, but neither conclusion has been established. As of the current reporting, no bodies have been recovered from the property, and Eugene has not been charged with harming Amy McHale or Blair Tonzelli. What investigators have are questions, a tremendous number of them, and that's where we're going to leave episode 3, back at this house. But now it looks different, doesn't it? Because now you know about the man who lived here before this investigation exploded. R.C. Horsch, the artist, the filmmaker, the writer, the convicted counterfeiter and drug manufacturer, the man who deliberately blurred autobiography and fiction, and the former husband of Amy McHale, the woman whose disappearance in 2016 remains unresolved. RC died in 2025. He cannot answer the questions investigators are asking today. Eugene is alive and facing criminal charges arising from the 2026 investigation, but he has not been charged with killing these missing women. His attorney has denied that he harmed them. And Amy and Blair remain at the center of an investigation that has generated more questions than answers. That's what makes this case so compelling and so important to cover responsibly. Because somewhere between RC's fictional world, Eugene's alleged crimes, the material investigators recovered, and the stories of the women connected to this property, there are answers. The question is whether investigators will find them. And in episode 4, we're going to turn our attention away from the Horsch men for a moment. We're going to focus on the women. Who were they? How did they become connected to this house? What happened before they disappeared? and what evidence actually connects them to the investigation. Because Amy McHale and Blair Tanzelli aren't simply names in a mystery, they are the reason finding the truth matters. Because Amy McHale, Blair Tanzelli, and the other women whose names have surfaced in this investigation deserve more than being remembered as part of a mystery. They deserve their stories to be told, and that's exactly where we're going next. In episode 4, we'll look at the women behind this investigation, their lives, their disappearances, their connections to the people and places we've been investigating, and what authorities have actually uncovered so far. Some of what we're going to examine is disturbing, but we're going to do what we've done throughout this series, separate what we know from what we don't. So subscribe to Halloween Night Vibe, turn on your notifications, and join me for episode 4. Because after everything we've uncovered so far, there is still much more to this story. I'll see you in episode 4.